Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll kick things off. So a warm welcome to everybody in the room and everybody online to our first seminar back from the summer break. And to kick things off, we have three PhD students just going into their second year who are going to be giving some talks about what research they've been doing and are planning to do for the next couple of years. So just a brief introduction about AFRICAP. AFRICAP stands for the Agricultural and Food System Resilience, Increasing Capacity and Advising Policy. This is a programme funded by the GCRF to make food and agricultural systems across sub-Saharan Africa more productive, sustainable and resilient to climate change. It's co-led here at the University of Leeds and in South Africa by FANRAPAM, and we're working with local organisations and governments across 4 sub-Saharan African countries: Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia and South Africa. So funded by the GCRF, the Global Challenges Research Fund, which is a 1.5 billion fund to support cutting-edge research that addresses the challenges faced by developing countries. GCRF forms part of the UK's commitment to official development assistance. So I think that's more than enough from me, and we're going to kick things off with Ruth Smith, our first student. Ruth is a Priestley-funded PhD student. As I said, going into her second year. I think this is officially your last year and your last week of your first year. And her PhD is an intersectional approach to exploring gendered influences of CSA, so climate smart agricultural adoption, within smallholder farmers in Tanzania. Do I need to change things?
Thank you, Harriet. Very kind introduction. So as Harriet said, I'm a first year PhD student, last week, still claiming I'm the first year. So I'm researching how gender influences the adoption of CSA practices in Tanzania under the supervision of Dr. Susie Salou and Dr. Anna Ndashe. And my project aligns with the wider AFRICAP project, and I'll just be talking about how my research is going so far. So my research is premised on the belief that there's limited understanding of how gender influences agricultural decision making in terms of crops grown and agricultural practices adopted, and how this affects the adoption of CSA practices. So the overall aim is that the improved understanding of how the priorities and barriers faced by different social groups in adopting and upscaling CSA practices, and of how gender influences the inter-household decision-making process, will contribute towards improving the evidence base for tailored CSA programming. So for this, I've got 4 research objectives. The last 3 are going to be influenced by an extended period of fieldwork in Tanzania, which is due to start next month. I'm going to be using a range of qualitative and participatory research methods to explore how gender influences the adoption of CSA practices. But for today, I'm going to be focusing on my first research objective, which is on a desk-based study of Tanzania policy and programming and how gender is featured within this. So for this, I have I've got a number of research questions. I'm looking at Tanzania national policies in the realms of CSA, agriculture in general, climate change and development. I'm looking at how gender is discussed and framed within this, and how these compare to dominant gender narratives within academic literature. I also plan to include some policies from different administrative levels, so local level and district development plans. And this will be useful to explore how gender discourse and narratives are adapted and understood at different levels. And it will also be interesting to analyse how policy actors at lower administrative levels sometimes have to adopt a gender discourse in order to access funds, and how they understand this. I'm also planning on including some project documents to see if there's any disconnects between policy and practice, and how the discourse is filtered down to projects on the ground. So at the moment, I'm in the preliminary of this analysis. And I'm making my way through Tanzania's national policies. So this presentation is just on the initial findings so far. So it's important to look at policy instruments as they reflect the endpoint of what governments think is important and what needs to change. As such, they represent policy, problem representations. Analysing policies allows an understanding of these issues, how they are framed and what the government proposes to do about them. So discourse means the definitions of weight which is given to different words and concepts, which ultimately influences how the public understands certain issues. And discourse analysis understands that policies are socially constructed and allows understanding of the role of language in constituting policies and how narratives are created. So the methods I've used for this is a discourse analytical policy analysis method and a critical policy instrument analysis. And I've been examining how discourses addressing gender issues in relation to agricultural development and climate change have materialised in the policy documents. So I've been using inductive coding supported by NVivo software to look at any mention of gender and how gender issues were contextualised. That's the first round of coding. The second round of coding, I'm going to be searching for key terms to make sure that I've not missed anything in the text. And then following this, I'll be looking at the coded text to group it into themes and emergent narratives. So at the moment, I've only conducted the initial round of coding on a number of national policy documents. So these are initial findings. These are the policy documents I've analysed so far. So all in the realms of CSA, agriculture, climate change and development. I've used the FAO legislative database to find the policy documents, and I've only included policy documents from 2010 onwards, because that's when the concept of CSA was introduced. So these are my initial narratives that have emerged so far. So I'm going to go over them all in more detail in a second, but just gender being either inconsistently discussed or not being included at all. Gender just being used to discuss women, leading into reinforcing gendered stereotypes, a lack of a clear action plan on how to reduce gendered inequalities, repetitive and inconsistent gender recommendations, and leading on to why they're being included in the first place. So the first narrative, in many policies, gender was either completely overlooked or not discussed, or was inconsistently included. The examples here are from the second agricultural sector development plan and strategy. Neither of these documents mention gender in the overview of the first edition of the policy, and neither is it mentioned in the overview of the constraints and threats facing agricultural development. ASDP 2 mentions the need saying that it needs to ensure gender and youth mainstreaming is operationalised in all of its interventions, but it's unclear how this will be achieved, and there's no mention of reducing gendered inequalities and the expected benefits. The second strategy, again, gender is not mentioned in the policy goals or objectives, and there's very little mention of gender across the whole document. So the second narrative is gender, where gendered inequalities are discussed in relation to agriculture, often focused solely on women, with the potential vulnerabilities of men being overlooked. So within this, there are three dominant narratives, women being more vulnerable to climate change and affected by its impacts, women having lower agricultural productivity, and unequal gender roles, meaning women had more domestic responsibilities. And the most commonly discussed reasons for these were women having less access to resources and information, less assets, less education and training, and less say in decision making. And this isn't to say that these reasons aren't true, but they do feed into the narrative that A, women are all the same and are always victims of climate change and possess little agency in agricultural development, and B, that men are not vulnerable. And these narratives reflect dominant discourses within international climate policy and development discourse, where women are often portrayed as suffering victims and inherently vulnerable to climate change. These simplified narratives are often popular as they provide an entry point for gender in development, as it is easier for institutions to relate to women as victims and hardest hit by environmental crisis who need the development assistance of the North. And they're often used to promote a women-centred approach and lead to a one-size-fits-all programme design. And this leads into my third narrative, that the reinforcing of gendered stereotypes. Women are always disadvantaged in society, they are always inherently closer to the environment, and they have the sole responsibility for caring and household tasks. These are some of the quotes taken from different documents to demonstrate this point. So women have inadequate skills and knowledge, they're more affected by climate impacts, and they depend on the environment more. And these narratives reduce gender to the biological differences between men and women, with women alone being seen advantaged. Vulnerability to climate, this is a problem because vulnerability to climate change and agricultural productivity is not defined by gender alone, and these narratives homogenise women into a single grouping, and they overlook the influence of any other social attributes such as wealth and age, which can arguably have a big impact on vulnerability to climate change. And these generalisations often make it impossible to meet the highly specific needs of different groups of women and men. So it also overlooks potential vulnerability of men. So I would argue that probably a poor, uneducated male farmer is likely more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than a wealthy, educated female farmer, yet their needs are often overlooked within policy. So my fourth narrative is a lack of a clear action plan. And this highlights a frequent disconnect between policy objectives and planned interventions. Policies rarely discuss how gender issues will be resolved or how they plan to tackle gender inequalities. Where they did discuss reducing gender inequalities in the objectives, there were rarely any gender policy success indicators outlined, which suggests that it would be difficult to track the progress towards these desired objectives. So the first example here given is from the CSA programme written in 2015. Gender is included in the first core objective, but it's not discussed how CSA factors should consider gender, and gender is not mentioned in any of the policy actions to achieve these objectives. The second example is from the CSA guideline 2017, which says enhanced gender and youth capacity to adapt was frequently included across the 21 study sites, but it was never really outlined how this should be achieved. And the third example is from the second 5-year development plan, which discussed the needs for interventions to ensure that gender and women economic empowerment, but doesn't outline what interventions are needed and how they should be achieved. So the fifth narrative is that there are a number of cases where the text around gender clearly been copy and pasted across different study sites and policies. So this example is again from the CSA guideline 2017, which outlines the recommended CSA factors to be adopted across 21 study sites in Tanzania. And across numerous study sites, the gender recommendations didn't match the recommended CSA practices. And this example here demonstrates that despite orchards being only included in the recommended CSA factors for 4 of the 21 study sites, it was included in the gender recommendations for over half. So you can see here that the first study site also had detailed gender recommendations, but as it filtered down through the policy, they were just being repeated, and they often didn't match the CSA practices recommended. So this suggests that gender recommendations are simply being copy and pasted across different study sites with little consideration of the local context, which suggests that gender is not being fully considered and leads on to the final narrative of why it's being included in the first place. So in 1/3 of the documents analysed, gender considerations were lumped in with youth in the cross-cutting section of the document, yet it's never really outlined how it cross-cuts different sectors of society. Most policies encourage gender mainstreaming to reduce gendered inequalities, yet few define what they mean by this or how it should be achieved. These examples here are taken from 3 different policy documents which show how gender is being included in the cross-cutting section, where it should be addressed in all thematic areas, often through gender mainstreaming as a solution, but it's not outlined how this should be done in practice. Enforcing existing political departments to tackle gendered inequalities without offering training on gender needs to staff is unlikely to have much of an impact. This suggests that the inclusion of youth and gender across many policies may be just a box-ticking exercise. Gender issues are not being fully considered, so why are they being included? Likely it's to attract and access funding from different organisations. So these 6 emergent narratives have demonstrated that gender considerations are being inconsistently included across Tanzania policy, and that there is a lack of meaningful policy instruments to reduce gendered inequalities within agriculture. This suggests a lack of understanding of how gender influences agricultural development and suggests it's only being included to meet donor requirements. So the next steps for this, for me, I plan to include some more national level policies in the realms of livestock, fisheries and water, and also to include subnational and local level policies to explore how these narratives change down through administrative levels, and to include some project level documents to see how this discourse translates into action on the ground. And I'm hoping that the overall aim will be able to identify possible entry points to move towards more effective strategies and policies to address gendered inequalities. There's some references, and thank you very much for listening.
Please. For the moment, we'll take, if anyone has any kind of shorter questions now, we'll do them after each presentation, and then at the end we'll have more of a, I guess you can call it round table panel discussion. But does anyone have any questions at this moment for Ruth, either in the room or online?
I was wondering if you could give a few examples of what you might consider as gendered CSA interventions that promote CSA, that have a gender gender bias.
Yeah, some projects and things promote things like more CSA factors, like improved cooking stoves that reduces time for women to being in there, and yeah, my mind's gone blank, sorry. But I also want to look at, make sure it's not just gender that's being the controlling factor, and look at how age and different things can influence what CSA practices are more suitable for different groups. Yeah.
So you're thinking the angle of having a woman with a male in the farmer.
Mm-hmm.
Are you also thinking couple?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I've seen in Malawi that women were having quite strong influence actually on their husband.
Yeah, and I don't want to just, a lot of agriculture and gender studies just compare male and female plots, but obviously that doesn't really understand the complex reality where they're managed by both people at the same time. So yeah, I won't be just looking at just.
I was surprised that that's several times I hear that was he told me that was his wife.
Really?
Who didn't want him to switch to.
Yeah. I said objective, and we'll be looking at how intra-household decision making and how gender influences that, along with other social attributes. So
anything from the online community?
No.
Thank you. So next up we have Ndashe Kapulu, who prior to starting his PhD, he worked with the Ministry of Agriculture in Zambia as a legume agronomist. So he's certainly the expert to his own PhD, which is good, before he probably started, because his PhD is looking at the implications of soya expansion on livelihood outcomes and food and nutrition security in rural households in Zambia.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to my presentation. And like Dr. Harriet mentioned, I'm Ndashe Kapulu from Zambia. So my work is part of the AFRICAP capacity building perspective of the project. But at the same time, my work will also feed into some of the key objectives of the project. So today I'm going to talk to you about how emerging markets in Zambia, you know, how soybean rather is how markets for soybean are emerging in Zambia, and specifically the implication this has on rural households. So those are my supervisors. So I would like to start my talk by talking about why agriculture is very important to a country like Zambia. So first of all, one thing you will notice from this map is that Zambia is one of the most undernourished countries in the world. So about 50% of the population are undernourished. But most importantly, 56% of Zambia's population live in rural settings and they depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. And most importantly, women, who are the most vulnerable, provide the labor for agriculture. So why soybean? So soybean is a very interesting crop in the sense that it is one of the world's most traded agricultural commodities, simply because it can be used for several things. So for instance, you can use it for human food. So it's used in the confectionery industry, even in the cosmetic industry. But most importantly also, it's also used for livestock feeds and several other uses. But most importantly in Africa, it is being integrated into cereal cropping systems as a soil improving legume to help improve farmer productivity. And recent evidence from work that was done shows that soybean is poised to dominate crop production in Africa. And when we zero in on Zambia, so if you look at Zambia, in terms of crop production, the current production for soybean is somewhere around 200,000 metric tons per annum. But by 2050, it is projected this will double or probably even increase and exceed about 500,000 tons per annum. The same thing happens for the area under agriculture. But if you zero in and look at the productivity somewhat remains the same. And I tend to argue that probably what might happen for us to get to these levels are two things. So either crop use change might happen, or probably land use change may occur. So zeroing in on Zambia, Zambia as a country has also undergone rapid soybean expansions in recent times. For instance, in the last 20 years, production has increased eightfold. And similarly, if you look at the graph, you see that even the area under production, so the area under production there is green, and the shaded area in brown is the production. So you see that production tends to increase exponentially over time. And some of the factors that are responsible for this, of course, if you see somewhere around 2009, 2010 there, the cost of 1 ton of soybean is around $520 US. If you look at the price for maize for a ton, round about the same period, and I must also say this has been the average price for a ton of maize which most smallholder farmers in Zambia grow, it has pretty much remained the same. But the price of soybean has increasing, and so has the level of production. If you zero in, say, in the period between 2010 and 2017, you will notice that, first of all, the solid blue lines, that is the amount of production under commercial farmers. Then the solid brown line, that's production under small-scale farming. The dotted lines represent the area. So one thing you will see if, say, we focus on the smallholder farmers is somewhere around 2015 thereabout, you see a rapid rise in the number of smallholder farmers who are growing soybean. But one interesting thing I would like to point out is the area actually supersedes the production. So meaning for them to produce the soybean that they're producing, they are using more land. That's when you compare to the commercial farmers who have very high productivity and use land under commercial agriculture hasn't increased very much. So in terms of factors that are driving the expansions of soybean in Zambia, so one of the things, of course, is a shift in diet. So Zambia is one of the fastest urbanizing countries in Africa. And with that, you know, you see a shift towards meat-based diets. And the other thing also is there's been increased local processing capacity for soybean into various products. So in this figure, all those things you see, so for instance, on the top left corner, that's a soybean meal. And these are different soybean products that are being processed locally in the country. And the other thing I would like to mention is also in recent times, there's been increased policy support. So soybean was recently introduced on the input support program by the government. So this is basically targeted at small scale farmers. And the last thing, there's also been a huge push in terms of trying to create awareness among smallholder farmers on the benefits of soybean growing. So these things taken together somewhat are driving the expansion. So coming now to the focus of my work, the key question that I would like to critically evaluate is how does agricultural transformation to soybean production impact on the livelihoods, food and nutrition security of rural households, particularly in the central region of Zambia. And later on, I think I'll highlight why I zero in on the central region of Zambia. So using the sustainable livelihoods framework, I focus on basically how the production system for these smallholder farmers will be altered through the introduction, or through maybe the transformation to soybean, and how that ultimately impacts on their income, their diets, and ultimately the nutritional status of women and children, and overall how that might also impact on how resilient they might be to various climatic shocks. So we undertook a survey under the AFRICAP project in May this year in 2 rural districts of central Zambia, so that's Mukushi and Chibombo. So basically these 2 districts occur in the main soybean belt of Zambia. So soybean is mainly produced in the central, with a few pockets in the northern and some aspects in the eastern part of the country. So we surveyed 400 households, of which 200 children and 276 children and 264 women were evaluated in terms of their diet, assessment as well as their anthropometry. So the overarching question that I ask from this survey is, how does participating in soybean value chains affect their livelihood, food and nutritional security? So why Chibombo and Mukushi? Mukushi is a rural district located further away from urban cities in Zambia. It is a district that is mixed. It has a mixed farming type of agricultural system in place. So you have commercial, you have middle and small scale farmers, and they engage in various forms of agriculture. And one thing you see along the roads to Mukushi is you have these small roadside stores where these farmers engage in vegetable growing and several other things. Whereas Chibombo is located in close proximity to Lusaka, which is the main capital city. So Lusaka provides various output markets. So most of the multinational companies are there in terms of access to input and output markets. The farmers are fairly connected. And most importantly, Chibombo is also home to one of the largest soybean processing plants in the country. And one thing you also see there is mainly predominantly small scale farming. And as opposed to Mukushi, the farmers in Chibombo also keep some small livestock, as you can see below there. And like I said, Mount Meru, which is one of the major multinational companies, is in Chibombo, and they provide these output markets and outgrower schemes for smallholder farmers. So the survey focused on several modules, but in terms of my research, I'm interested in the household characteristics, the agricultural farming systems, the anthropometry, which is a measure of health status for both women and children, household well-being, household asset status, as well as the diet assessment, which we conducted via 24-hour recall and a 7-day food frequency questionnaire. So basically, those are just some of the highlights from the survey which we conducted early this year. In terms of the key focus of my question, so basically we'll compare how soybean growers and non-soybean growers, some of the outcomes in terms of their food security, their nutritional security, and their livelihoods are impacted so by either participating in soybean or by them just growing different other crops. So we'll look at several things. For instance, we'll look at the diet quality. We'll then also look at, like I said, maternal and child anthropometry, their socioeconomic status, and lastly, farm productivity and diversity. And those are just on the far left in the indicators column. Those are some of the indicators we'll look at. So we'll look at the household diversity score and going all the way up to farm crop productivity or crop diversity scores. So in terms of my other future plans, after looking at the outcomes of the survey, I will then conduct an in-depth study, which will then look at what factors motivate small-scale farmers to participate in soybean value chains. And to do this work, we use participatory approaches, so things like focus group discussions, key informant interviews, as well as just general observations. And at the end of the day, through triangulation of these different data sources, we'll then develop a deeper understanding in terms of how transitioning to soybean production impacts on agrarian households in Africa, using Zambia as a case study. Secondly, some of this work will also feed into the AFRICAP framework, which is based on knowledge exchange and among different participating countries. As Harriet earlier on alluded to, AFRICAP is being implemented in 4 different countries. So some of the findings from this work will feed into that. And last but not the least, my work will also generate some evidence-based data to support the development of a national soybean strategy, as well as a way of advocating for policy in Zambia with regard to the overall picture of climate change. Having said that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
very much, Ndashe. Do we have any questions for the moment? Any online? Oh, Henry.
What are your sort of hypotheses? What are your expectations based on what you currently know in terms of possible impacts that soybean production is likely to have on these agrarian households? Do you have some sort of feeling as to what the outcomes might be at this stage?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so basically, yes, in the sense that how might soybean either improve the current production system, either through maybe increasing their diversity in terms of the different crops they grow, and how that might ultimately impact on their income. So that's one thing I'm interested in. But the reverse is also potentially possible, because like I indicated, because of this huge market drive, and in the second slide I show you that the productivity doesn't actually grow, it somewhat remains the same. So a potential scenario might happen where they begin to replace other crops that they might actually eat or might be more nutritious, because of course I didn't get into the other aspects of soybean from a household consumption perspective. So how might transitioning to soybean impact on crop diversity? Will it either increase or decrease? And to maybe directly answer your question, to some extent, the farmers who are somewhat driven by market might choose to begin converting some of their land, to soybean, which is a bit more profitable. So it might, to some extent, impact on the number of crops they grow. Yeah.
Any other questions?
You already answered my question. So when I saw your graph exploding like that, I immediately think what is being that is substituting for.
Yeah.
Is this replacing mate productions? Is there any intercropping taking place? It's possible, but what land? Which is the land used to drive this expansion?
From my own experience, normally soybean is not intercropped because of the way the crop is. So it's either grown in rotation with a cereal, in this case maize. So in Zambia, maize is the main crop, and that's one aspect I'm interested in to further explore, particularly how maybe the farmers are allocating land. And in the survey, I think we ask some of those questions in terms of land allocation to different crops. So I must say the data from the survey just came in, so I'm yet to explore, for me maybe to give you a more concrete answer.
And so how is the market? Can Zambia export this soya bean?
So there's a bit of a debate around that, in the sense that because soybean is a legume and it's an open pollinated crop, so basically the grain can actually be grown as seed. So within the region, I think, I don't know if that has changed, and most of the countries within the SADC region have put a cap on the exportation of soybean as grain because of that particular reason. So you need to pre-crush it for you to export it. You can't export the grain. So currently, no. Yeah.
Ooh, a question from Marta who's online, and she would like to know what the predicted soybean performance would be under climate change.
Yeah, so from that paper, they also argue to say one of the reasons soybean will dominate crop production is because, based on the climatic predictions, it will be more or less like a more it will provide a more resilient alternative to smallholder agriculture for Africa. Because according to the modeling, it shows that yes, soybean might be a more suitable option. And of course, some of the key things that highlight, one are improvements in breeding programs. I think that's the main thing. I think new materials are being released, and one of the amazing things, for instance, in regard to Zambia, when you compare to other legume crops, the seed sector in Zambia, particularly the private seed sector in Zambia, is actually pushing quite a number of varieties on the market for soybean when you compare to other legume crops. Yeah.
Thank you, Ndashe.
Thank you.
So last but not least, we have Emmanuel Likoya. Emmanuel is also a first/second year student, all in there last week. His PhD is looking at agricultural water modelling under future climate change and examination of irrigation interventions. Emmanuel is currently not in the room. He is in Malawi. So we are going to see if we can dial him in, and it will be our first remote seminar. It's quite exciting. I have no idea if this is going to work.
Try to say something, Emmanuel, and see if we can hear you.
Hi, everyone.
There we go.
Greetings from Malawi. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there with you, but
Great, please go ahead, Emmanuel.
I don't take this for granted, and I thank you for the opportunity. All right, thank you. On my research, the title of which is Drought Processes in Current and Future Climate and Implications for Irrigation and Resilient Food Production Systems in Malawi. So, as a matter of definition, I would like to define a drought as a sustained period of low precipitation or low rainfall. But I do realize that there are other definitions that have to do with water deficits in soil or in water bodies such as rivers and lakes. So in my study, I'm going to focus on this broad definition of drought to reflect the risk of drought from meteorological, agricultural, as well as hydrological perspectives. And this study is being done in Malawi. At the moment, we only have a tentative plan as to where specifically in Malawi we're going to do the analysis, or are we going to focus down the analysis too. But as a matter of a background, droughts present one of the significant challenges in as far as food production is concerned in Malawi. And this is so because Malawi mainly relies on what I would call poorly developed rain-fed agricultural systems. And due to climate variability, which among other things is characterized by extreme events such as droughts and floods, there are challenges that are frequently occurring in as far as food production is concerned. And years with droughts have usually been characterized by low yields, such that years such as 2004 and 2005, or the most recent 2015 and 16, were characterized by significant yield losses that amounted to about $500 million in recovery. And as a result, the government of Malawi, as well as its development partners, which includes NGOs and the donor community, have been investing heavily in irrigation, which is widely perceived as a key tenet in building resilient food production systems. And as a result of that, so as I was saying, that there is massive investment in irrigation food production systems by the Malawi government as well as its development partners. And as a result, there has been heavy investment in trying to map out the areas which are suitable for irrigation. And the map that you're seeing to your right is the characterization of different areas which are suitable for irrigation farming of different crops. And this is usually determined by mapping out where it is physically suitable for arable production, as well as where there is enough water resources to meet irrigation demand given the crop that is decided, or the crop that is planned to be planted in that sort of irrigation system. However, in trying to map out such areas, there has been no considerable climate change has not been taken into account as posing a major threat to irrigation systems in such a way that in trying to map out areas which might be suitable for irrigation in future, there is rarely any use of climate information. The only scenarios that are taken into account are development as well as population growth scenarios that could affect water demand. And climate change in itself is not considered as being part of the appraisal process in trying to map out such areas where irrigation could be suitable or not. And other than just determining the suitability, it could also be a way of informing how best we can design such irrigation systems so that they are responsive to any future changes in climate. As such, the main justification is that it is imperative that we understand the risk of drought in future climate and the implications for evolving food production systems, because the irrigation systems that we have to develop have to be conceived in the right way. If poorly conceived, then they could fall short of their expected gains or present new vulnerabilities altogether. Recent studies can back this up. This is a recent study that has been done under the Umfula project, and this is showing responses to climate change between 2021 and 2050, and this is outflow from Lake Malawi, and as you can see that there the different caves are different climate scenarios, and this is business as usual in as far as water demand is concerned. So as you can see that under different climate scenarios, there are different responses in as far as outflow from Lake Malawi is concerned, which somehow paints a picture in terms of availability of water resources to meet investments such as irrigation systems. However, for us to be able to say how the risk of drought is going to change in future is not an easy task. And this is somewhat a popular image among the climate science community working in Southern Africa. And to an extent, it illustrates the complexity in terms of the climate system of the region and how that complexity is mirrored in climate models and the results that they give. And to just to highlight that Malawi here lies in the transition region between the Southern African climate as well as the Eastern African climate. As such, it gets its signal from Eastern Africa and Southern Africa. And somehow it is very difficult to paint a consistent image in terms of how the climate is going to change in future and how that is going to translate into changes in systems such as irrigation systems, which mainly rely on the hydrological cycle, which in turn relies on the functionality or how the climate system is functioning. Just to highlight that, the map that you're seeing is of rainfall deficits in the in the 2015-16 season. And this season was characterized by drying across Southern Africa due to a very strong El Nino, which is often associated with drier conditions in the south. But as you can see, in terms of responses across Malawi, in the December to February months, which is the main rainfall season, the southern parts were drier than normal, while the northern parts were wetter than normal. And this was consistent in the March, April, May seasons as well, which to an extent limits or presents a challenge in as far as predictability of droughts in the current climate, as well as quantification of risk in the future climate is concerned. This also presents a challenge in assessing droughts and the atmospheric processes that are associated with them in the current climate. And these challenges in as far as the complexity of the climate system and its representation in climate models is concerned is usually reflected in projections of mainly rainfall. I should say that there is consistency in the projection of changes in temperature in future. But this graph here is a result from different models and how they project how rainfall is going to change in future. So as you can see, that quite a big number of models pointing towards a dry future, while an equally great number of models is pointing towards a wetter future with different magnitudes of wetting and drying. And I should say that due to some recent investments in research in climate science over the region, there has been some understanding or insights into the climate system and how it's going to change in future have improved. But this has not necessarily translated into a good understanding of how models do project changes in drought and drought risk going into the future climate. This is further compounded by an incomplete understanding of how the meteorological risk of drought propagates into agricultural and hydrological droughts. By definition, these agricultural and hydrological droughts are usually characterized by deficits in soil moisture as well as deficits in stream flow or water resources in inland water bodies or groundwater. But the association between these and deficits in rainfall is not well understood in these parts. So this presents a challenge in terms of utilization of drought information to guide irrigation developments that are aimed at building resilient in the food production systems in Malawi. But global studies, however, indicates an increase in global future risk of drought, as well as irrigation water demand. So the map that you're seeing here is future irrigation water demand. And for most parts of Southern Africa, it is projected to increase. As such, this has to be reflected in the designs as well as in the investments of irrigation systems, which are at the moment based on only current climate and do not reflect any future climate scenarios. And to that point, the aim of my research is to try and improve understanding of drought processes in the current and future climates in order to create a basis for appraising sustainable irrigation investments aimed at enhancing resilience in Malawian food production systems. And to do this, I have 4 specific objectives. The first one of which is to examine characteristics of droughts in Malawi and their associated regional circulation patterns. And to do this, I will use a standard index, which is called the Standardized Precipitation and Evapotranspiration Index, together with the theory of runs to characterize droughts, as well as composite analysis, which is used to analyze circulation patterns associated with drought conditions. And as part of this objective, I have some preliminary results. This plot here is a time series of droughts between 1950 and 2015. And as you can see that post the 1990 period, there has been an increase in the frequency of droughts. And this is for Malawi. This is for the northern part of Malawi, and this is for the southern part of Malawi. I have deliberately focused on the northern and southern parts of Malawi because of the map that I showed you earlier in terms of the differences in responses to mostly El Nino and other weather influencing systems in Southern Africa, as well as in in Eastern Africa. And just to highlight that the differences in responses are actually reflected in the occurrence of droughts in Malawi. As you can see from this video, this is the time series of droughts in southern and northern parts of Malawi. There is not really a difference in terms of the characteristics of the droughts themselves, but there is a difference in terms of when those droughts occur, in such a way that in years when you have droughts in the southern regions, then in the same year you may expect to have wetter conditions in the northern regions and vice versa. And just to reflect on other drought characteristics, this plot is showing drought severity, mean drought severity, and as I said, that there is not really any significant differences in terms of droughts in the north in the future. This is also to reflect the duration of drought, and this is the duration of drought is like the time that is taken for a drought to last. And as you can see as well, there is a patch in terms of longevity of droughts in the north, which somewhat reflects longer duration droughts in the north, but not so much in the south. And these plots, as you can see, they have SPI 1, 0, 3, 0, 9, and 12. That is just to reflect different categories of droughts in terms of duration. The SPI 01 is for droughts that last up to a month, and the SPI 12 is for droughts that last up to 12 months. The same can be said about drought intensity. And this curve is just to summarize what is shown in these plots. And as I indicated earlier, that the differences, so far what I've noticed is that the differences in the driving mechanisms of droughts does not really influence the characteristics of droughts themselves, but rather the occurrence or the time and the period in which the droughts occur. Other characteristics of droughts or relationships also indicate the same for severity, drought severity, and the area extent of the drought. And the next step from this is to analyze the atmospheric variables. So the results that I have for now are quite raw, and I could not present them here. But this will be to look at the atmospheric conditions when droughts occur in relation to atmospheric conditions over a long period of time. And moving on from that, the second objective is to evaluate selected CNIF5 models and the added value of newly developed regional climate models on the basis of their ability to realistically simulate drought characteristics and associated regional circulation patterns. And this is deliberately done to look at how models reflect how different models project or simulate droughts in the current climate, and to what extent they can be relied upon in terms of telling us what is likely to happen in future and as far as drought risk is concerned. So to do this, I will repeat the analysis that we had done for objective 1, but I will do them on climate model outputs rather than the observed climate. The third objective is to analyze now how the drought propagates from meteorological aspects to agricultural and hydrological aspects. And to do this, I will run the soil and water assessment tool, which is a hydrological model, and it is based on ArcGIS, and it is forced by climate variables. And these climate variables will be downscaled outputs from different climate models, just to see how the model responds to different climate model outputs, which to an extent or somehow paints a picture of how irrigation water demand and availability of water to meet that demand is going to change in future. And to finalize my study, I will assess the added value of this scientific understanding and the extent to which it can add value to plans and policies designed to overcome impacts of drought on food production systems through establishment of irrigation systems. And this will be done mainly through policy analysis, as well as key informant interviews and focus group discussions. So just to share with you some of the pictures that I took from my recent visit to Nkota, which is, I think, I should say an AFRICAP site for in Malawi, but also an area of interest in my study. This is a 17-hectare irrigation scheme that is mainly operated by smallholder irrigation farmers in Nkota. It's called Linga EPA. And this is where the water, this is the water intake point. And as you can see that this is only a temporary structure. When I visited, they said it has only been there for 2 months because the first 2 main structures that were there could not withstand extreme events. So to an extent, this also highlights the extent to which climate information can help in adding value to investments in irrigation systems through infrastructure that is designed to withstand extreme events in a changing climate. This is just a rice paddy in that irrigation system. Some irrigation schemes also focus on maize, and maize and rice, I should say, are my main focus crops. And this is a weir which is damaged from the irrigation scheme that I showed you earlier, where the farmers had to improvise and build a temporary structure. This canal highlights some of the challenges that the farmers meet when there is low water levels to an extent that there is no outflow from the intake point. This is one of the large-scale harvesting points. It's also in Nkota, but it's in a different area, and the irrigation scheme is called BUA. It supports about 800 farmers, and it's about 350 hectares. And this is the canal that brings water to the irrigation scheme from the intake point, and it's an 8-kilometer canal, but it's open, which means there are losses due to evapotranspiration, which could somehow be enhanced in a changing climate if temperatures increase. And this is part of the irrigation scheme after at the end of that 80-kilometer canal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Do we have any questions? Any questions online?
Thanks, Emmanuel. Presumably all the water that's used in these irrigation schemes originates from the lake. Is that correct?
No, it's not from the lake. It's from streams, but these streams end up into the lake.
Oh, they feed the lake. Okay. I mean, if the projections are for drought and the solution is increased irrigation and development of irrigation schemes, can, based on current water harvesting strategies employed in Malawi, Is it considered sustainable to increase the amount of irrigation that is forecast to be required to maintain product production?
So at the moment, there are several initiatives that seek to develop irrigation schemes, but this is at different scales. So some of them are pointing towards development of quite efficient harvesting techniques and technologies, but some are still more like just trying to get water to the people or getting water to the field without necessarily focusing or without necessarily monitoring how much water we are harvesting and how much impact we are going to have downstream, and what is going to be the impact if there is low flow and there is not much water to harvest. So it's quite diverse in terms of investments as well as technologies. But as far as most smallholder operated schemes are concerned, then I wouldn't really think that they are sustainable in a way, both in terms of having an impact in downstream flow after the point of harvesting, as well as whether they are going to withstand extreme events in terms of low flows or high flows. I don't know whether that answers your question because I couldn't get it clearly.
No, that's fine, and I know you answered it very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
The very general questions. What's how much of Malawi could really be benefiting from irrigation? It's quite easy. It's true that there will be a constraint in implementing the irrigation scheme. So, very general questions.
How much of Malawi in terms of number of people or the area?
Yeah, there's lots of mountains and in the lakes, what I've seen on the north, quite close from quite sharp relief. So there must be a limit to what you can do, really. I mean, I'm just curious to know a little bit more in what really is the scope of that could be implemented now.
All right, so in terms of the numbers, I'm not really sure at the moment in terms of the number of people that could benefit from such irrigation schemes, but this is something that also depends on land tenure issues, and somehow it depends on the proximity or whether you have a piece of land in the area that is being developed for irrigation. But also I should emphasize that there is a limitation in terms of how much water can be harvested for irrigation because there is competition for water uses. Malawi's electricity is mostly from hydro. So like most of the electricity is generated from or along the Shire River, which is an outlet of the Lake Malawi. So in as much as there are these investments in irrigation, there is still how much can be invested for irrigation and how much can be left for those other uses such as domestic use or hydro. So there are still those competing demands, and there are trade-offs that have to be worked out, and this could maybe be enhanced with a changing climate if we are going to end up in a scenario where we are going to have challenges in terms of water supply.
Thank you. Any final questions? We have a couple of minutes left, so perhaps are there any questions for the other two speakers? Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, perhaps kind of broadly relevant across the presentation. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting about soybean is that it's not just entering into a new crop, it's entering into new value chains and new contracts for production. And potentially that's also true of irrigation, where there's contracts associated with access to water. So I kind of have a two-part question in relation to that. One, which is for Ndashe to maybe tell us a bit about the nature of those contracts and the risks associated with that. And then maybe also for Ruth, whether she thinks there's a kind of gendered dimension to entering into new contracts. That means that there are kind of social inequities around transformation of agricultural systems of that nature.
Understand, Ndashe?
Yeah, so for the new contracts regarding farmer participation in soybean value chains. So basically, these value chains are mainly governed by multinational corporations. So one key thing that you observe, particularly in the Zambian case, is they provide inputs on a contract basis. So previously, I think they've adopted the cotton model where they'll provide seeds and agricultural inputs at the beginning of the season, and then agree on a predetermined market price, and then the farmers will then grow the soybean on contract. Yes, it has its own risks associated with that. Say, for example, if there's poor rainfall and there's crop failure, then there's potential for default. And then who then bears the cost? I think that has always been a contentious issue regarding, I think, the outgrower schemes. But then recently, we also see government coming into the picture in terms of them offering subsidy programs. So they've broadened the input subsidy for small-scale farmers in Zambia from just covering maize to now also covering crops like soybean. So again, in that model, the government comes into play. They offer the same inputs and seeds, and then they also buy back from the farmers the crop. Though for them it's not on a contract basis, but it's an open market system. But that also has its own implications in the sales side, because government has the leverage of setting a price, maybe not call it a floor price, but their own price. The risk associated with that is there's potential of private sector who in this case might offer more money being crowded out because of huge government involvement. So at the end of the day, given that the productivity for smallholder farmers is still low, there are several risks that are associated, I think, on their part. Say if they just decide to invest in this one crop, which say if it fails because of maybe climatic factors, they might not have the fallback plan. At the same time, there's a carrot dangling in the sense that there's a huge market opportunity for them to earn early income and better income, but it's still shrouded in those. I don't know.
Ruth?
Yeah, thank you. I think that was an interesting one because the project I'm planning on working alongside in Tanzania is focusing on promoting TSA practices and actually promoting soybean over maize as it's supposed to be a woman crop, because it uses less labour and it helps. They can use as feed chickens to improve nutrition for families. So I think it'll be interesting to look at that and how maybe it's adding additional labour requirements for women, responsibilities, and how gendered access to markets for a new crop
is at.
Final short question, Martin.
Yes, again, very short. It's like comment, really, to Ruth. I don't know if you consider maybe engaging in some sort of, or doing some sort of view of gender, gender-based issues in Tanzania, and I mean exploring what is it that underpins choices in terms of access to natural resources, access to land, decision making at the household level, really from an anthropological perspective. My view, perhaps this could give a wider range, wider scope in the education analysis based on what you are going to be you are seeing now from policy documents and what you are going to be getting on the ground from your interviews. So I'm just a suggestion that could be an interesting short review.
That would be important when I go to the field line, so it's really important.
Great. That is time, I think. So thank you again to our speakers, and thank you everybody in the room and online for coming. And the next seminar is?
It's on Monday the 21st of October, 11 AM UK time. We have Dr. Pedi O'Brien from the United Nations. There'll be a webinar facility for that as well.
Great. Thank you, everybody.